Jake Morrison walked into the Galactic Council chambers like he did every other day for the past 5 years. His dark suit was clean and pressed, his briefcase held the usual diplomatic papers, and his face showed the same calm expression that made him such a good negotiator. The other species representatives barely looked up as he took his seat at the human delegation table. They were too busy arguing about trade routes between the Vraxian Empire and the Kalari Republic. The chamber was huge, with seats arranged in circles that went up to the ceiling. Each species had their own section with special air and gravity controls. The Vraxians needed dry heat, the aquatic Thels required water-filled tanks, and the crystalline Zerathi lived in pressurized glass boxes. Only humans seemed comfortable in the standard atmosphere that filled most of the chamber. Speaker Zethkar raised his 6 arms to call for order. His blue-scaled face looked annoyed as he glared at the arguing delegates. The Kalari representative was clicking his mandibles rapidly while the Vraxian ambassador hissed through her breathing slits. It was the same kind of fight that happened every week, usually over something small that grew into something big because nobody wanted to back down. Jake opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. His assistant Lisa sat next. To him, her tablet ready to take notes. She had been working with Jake for 3 years and knew his habits. When he only brought 1 paper to a session, it usually meant something important was about to happen. The argument continued for another 20 minutes. The Kalari wanted exclusive mining rights to 3 asteroids in neutral space. The Vraxians claimed those same asteroids had been promised to them in a trade deal from 50 years ago. Both sides brought up old treaties, broken promises, and threats of economic sanctions. It was exactly the kind of mess that humans usually helped solve. Speaker Zethkar finally noticed that Jake had requested to speak. The Vraxian leader seemed surprised because humans rarely interrupted ongoing debates. They preferred to wait until both sides had exhausted themselves before offering solutions. Jake stood up slowly and walked to the central speaking platform. His footsteps echoed in the suddenly quiet chamber. Every species representative turned to look at him. The humans had built a reputation as the best mediators in the galaxy. When trade disputes arose, both sides often asked for human arbitrators. When peace treaties needed negotiating, human diplomats were the first choice. When complex technical problems required solutions that bridged different technologies, human engineers somehow made it work. Jake looked around the chamber at faces, scales, tentacles, and crystal formations that represented 47 different species. He had worked with most of them personally. He had helped the Thels design underwater cities that could trade with surface dwellers. He had shown the Zerathi how to communicate with organic species without damaging their crystal matrix. He had spent countless hours finding compromises that let different civilizations work together. The paper in his hand was simple and direct. No complex legal language, no diplomatic flowery words, just a basic statement that anyone could understand. Jake cleared his throat and began to read in his steady, clear voice that had guided so many negotiations to successful conclusions. The human delegation formally withdraws from all Galactic Council proceedings effective immediately. His words carried clearly through the chamber's audio systems. All human representatives, advisors, mediators, and support staff will be departing within the next 6 hours. Human embassies, trade stations, and diplomatic outposts throughout Council space will be closing permanently. The silence that followed was complete. Even the usual background humming of life support systems seemed louder than normal. Jake folded the paper and put it back in his jacket pocket. He walked back to his seat, closed his briefcase, and stood up again. Lisa gathered her tablet and the few personal items she kept at her desk. Speaker Zethkar was the first to recover from the shock. His voice came out as a confused hiss. "Ambassador Morrison, surely this is some kind of negotiating tactic. What are your demands for returning to the Council?" Jake looked at the Vraxian leader with the same calm expression he always wore. "There are no demands, Speaker Zethkar. This is not a negotiation. This is a departure. He picked up his briefcase and walked toward the exit. Lisa followed behind him, along with the other 12 humans who made up their delegation. The chamber erupted in chaos as they left. Representatives jumped to their feet, speaking in dozens of different languages all at once. Some demanded explanations, others offered immediate concessions for problems they thought they had caused. A few suggested that the humans were bluffing and would return within days. Jake and his team walked through the corridors they had traveled for years. Past the offices where they had worked late into the night, solving other species' problems. Past the meeting rooms where they had brokered peace between enemies. Past the technical labs where human engineers had made impossible things possible. They boarded their shuttle without looking back. Within hours, similar scenes played out across the galaxy as every human diplomat, engineer, mediator, and advisor quietly packed up and left their posts. No angry speeches, no dramatic gestures, no final ultimatums. They simply disappeared from galactic civilization as quietly and efficiently as they had served it. 3 months had passed since the humans left, and Speaker Zethkar was getting his first real taste of what running the Galactic Council meant without them. He sat in his private office looking at reports that made less sense each day. The numbers were wrong. The schedules were falling apart. And every species seemed to be fighting with every other species about things that used to get solved quietly. The Kalari-Theron mining dispute was the first real crisis. What had started as a simple disagreement about mineral rights had turned into something much worse. Without Lisa Parker mediating between them, both sides had stopped talking and started preparing for war. The Kalari had moved 3 battle fleets to the disputed system. The Therons had activated their defense satellites and were threatening to close all trade routes through their space. Zethkar remembered how Lisa used to handle these situations. She would sit with both sides for hours, asking questions that seemed simple, but somehow made everyone think about the problem differently. She had a way of finding solutions that made both parties feel like they were winning. Now she was gone, and nobody else seemed to know how to do what she did. The xenobiology research project was falling apart even faster. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been leading a team of scientists from 12 different species to develop new medical treatments. They were close to finding cures for diseases that affected millions of beings across the galaxy. Elena had somehow made scientists with completely different ways of thinking work together like one big family. Without her coordination, the project turned into a disaster. The hive mind researchers wanted to share all data freely with everyone. The Vraxian scientists insisted on keeping their discoveries secret until they could profit from them. The crystalline Zerathi needed information presented in mathematical formulas, while the organic species worked better with visual models. Elena had found ways to translate between all these different approaches, but now nobody could even agree on how to format their reports. Dr. Kent of the Theron Republic tried to take over Elena's job. He was a skilled scientist in his own field, but he had no idea how to manage the personality conflicts and cultural differences that Elena had handled so smoothly. Within 2 weeks, half the research teams had quit the project and taken their data with them. The medical breakthrough that could have saved millions was now scattered across 12 different worlds with no way to put the pieces back together. Supply chains throughout Council space were becoming a nightmare. Ryan Chang had been the human logistics coordinator who designed the shipping routes that connected hundreds of worlds. His system was so efficient that most species never thought about how their goods moved from one planet to another. Food, medicine, raw materials, and manufactured products just appeared where they were needed. Now those same shipping routes were clogged with delays and confusion. Cargo ships were arriving at the wrong planets or sitting in space waiting for permission to dock. The aquatic Thels needed special containers for their water-based products, but the companies that made those containers were running out of the rare metals they needed. Those metals came from Zerathi crystal mines, but the Zerathi were refusing. to sell to anyone who traded with the hive mind collectives. Ryan had somehow kept track of all these complicated relationships in his head. He knew which species would work with each other and which ones needed to be kept separate. He had backup plans for every major shipping route and emergency protocols for when things went wrong. Without him, the galactic economy was slowly strangling, itself with its own complexity. The Council tried to solve these problems the way they always had before humans joined them. They formed committees to study the issues. They held debates about the best approaches. They wrote detailed reports that explained all the different perspectives, but none of this actually fixed anything. Committee meetings that used to last 2 hours now dragged on for days without reaching any conclusions. The Vraxians wanted aggressive solutions that favored the strongest species. The Thels preferred patient approaches that considered everyone's feelings. The Zerathi insisted on mathematical precision that nobody else could understand. Without human mediators to find middle ground, every discussion ended in deadlock. Zethkar found himself working 18 hours a day instead of his usual 10. Problems that humans used to solve quietly were now landing on his desk as major crises. Trade disputes, technical failures, diplomatic incidents, and economic breakdowns were piling up faster than he could handle them. His staff was overwhelmed and confused by situations they had never dealt with before. The worst part was that nobody seemed to understand what had gone wrong. Most council members still believed the humans would come back once they realized how much they needed the galactic community. They thought this was just a temporary disagreement that could be fixed with the right offer or apology. Zethkar was starting to suspect the truth was much worse. He had been reviewing old records and discovering just how much humans had been doing behind the scenes. Every major agreement in the past 50 years had human fingerprints somewhere in the negotiation process. Every successful multi-species project had human coordinators making it work. Every crisis that had been resolved quickly had human problem solvers finding the solutions. The humans had not been junior partners learning from more advanced civilizations. They had been the glue holding galactic society together, and now that glue was gone. The Council was discovering that without humans to translate between different ways of thinking, facilitate cooperation between natural enemies, and find creative solutions to complex problems, the 47 species of the galaxy could barely function as a unified civilization. Zethkar stared at his latest stack of crisis reports and realized that 3 months might have been enough time to break things that had taken decades to build. If the humans did not come back soon, there might not be a galactic civilization left for them to rejoin. 6 months after the humans disappeared, the galaxy was burning. Zethkar stood in the Council emergency session, looking at holographic displays that showed red warning markers across half of known space. Each red dot represented a conflict, crisis, or complete breakdown of order that nobody seemed able to fix. The Outer Rim territories were the worst disaster. For 30 years, those frontier regions had been peaceful and stable under the guidance of human peacekeepers. Commander Alex Turner and his team had spent decades building trust between species that had been enemies for centuries. They had created a system where disputes got resolved through talking instead of fighting, where trade flowed freely, and where different civilizations could expand without stepping on each other. Alex had understood something that other peacekeepers missed. He knew that lasting peace could not be forced by superior firepower or threats of punishment. It had to be built through relationships, trust, and giving everyone a stake in keeping things calm. His approach had been so successful that most council members forgot how violent the Outer Rim used to be. Now, 3 separate wars were raging in sectors that had been quiet for decades. The Khazari clans had invaded Theron colonies, claiming that old treaty boundaries were no longer valid. The Silicon Swarm was expanding aggressively into systems that belonged to organic species. The Frost Giants had declared that all ice worlds were their natural territory regardless of who was already living there. Each conflict was spreading as neutral species were forced to choose sides or risk being conquered by whoever won. The careful balance that Alex had maintained was collapsing into the same kind of chaos that had plagued the region before humans arrived. Millions of beings were dying in wars that could have been prevented with the right words spoken at the right time. The Council's attempts to restore peace were making things worse. Traditional diplomacy meant sending ultimatums and threats, but that only made fighting species more determined to win before anyone could stop them. Military intervention meant choosing sides, which turned peacekeeping missions into larger wars. Every approach the Council tried was based on dominance and force instead of the patient relationship building that Alex had used. Technology development had ground to a complete halt across the galaxy. Human engineers had been the bridge that made impossible projects possible. They had ways of taking incompatible alien technologies and somehow making them work together. Katie Walsh had been the genius behind most of these integration projects, finding connections that nobody else could see. Katie had worked with Zeltharian quantum processors that operated on 11 dimensions and hive-mind biocomputers that grew like living organisms. She had figured out how to make crystalline Zarathi logic systems communicate with organic neural networks. Her hybrid technologies had revolutionized everything from faster-than-light travel to medical equipment. Without human integrators, each species was stuck using only their own technology. The Zeltharians could not benefit from hive-mind biological processing power. The Zarathi could not incorporate quantum improvements into their crystal matrices. Dozens of joint research projects that had been showing promising results were now abandoned because nobody else understood how to make different technologies work together. The galaxy was sliding backward technologically just when it needed innovation most. The growing conflicts required better weapons, faster ships, and more efficient production systems. But instead of advancing, most species were struggling to maintain equipment that depended on human-designed integration protocols they no longer understood. Economic collapse was spreading like a plague through Council space. The universal credit exchange had been calibrated by human economist Greg Miller to handle the complex trade relationships between dozens of different species. Each civilization had its own currency, its own economic system, and its own way of determining value. Greg had created algorithms that translated between all these different approaches and kept the galactic economy stable. Without Greg's constant adjustments, the credit exchange was producing wild fluctuations that made long-term planning impossible. Currency values were swinging dramatically from day to day. Trade agreements were becoming worthless because nobody could predict what anything would cost next month. Several smaller species had already abandoned the galactic economy and returned to simple barter systems. The breakdown was feeding on itself. Economic instability was making the various conflicts worse as species fought over resources they could no longer afford to buy. Military spending was draining budgets that were already strained by trade disruptions. Refugee movements from war zones were overwhelming planetary economies that were already struggling. Council meetings had become desperate affairs where species representatives blamed each other for problems that nobody knew how to solve. The Vraxians accused the Thels of economic sabotage. The Zarathi claimed that organic species were deliberately disrupting their crystal-based trade networks. The hive minds suggested that individualistic species were too selfish to maintain a stable economy. Zethkar realized that the Council was dissolving into the same kind of factional chaos that had existed before humans joined them. Species were returning to old alliances and ancient prejudices. The unity that had taken centuries to build was cracking apart in months. Emergency sessions were being called every few days to deal with new crises. Food shortages on agricultural worlds that depended on interstellar trade. Medical emergencies, where hospitals could not get supplies from other systems. Communication breakdowns between species that had different ideas about how to prioritize problems. Every solution the Council proposed seemed to create two new problems. Sending military aid to besieged colonies meant taking ships away from other trouble spots. Providing economic assistance to failing worlds meant raising taxes on species that were already struggling. Forcing peace negotiations meant bringing together representatives who could barely agree on what language to use. The humans had made all of this look easy. They had somehow kept dozens of different civilizations working together as one galactic community. They had prevented conflicts before they started, solved technical problems that seemed impossible, and maintained economic stability that everyone took for granted. Now the Council was learning that running a galactic civilization was not easy at all. It required skills, knowledge, and perspectives that they had never bothered to develop because humans had always been there to handle the difficult parts. 6 months of trying to manage without human help had shown them just how much they had been depending on people they had never really appreciated. Captain Nina Foster had been searching for humans for 2 months without finding a single one willing to talk. Her exploration vessel Horizon was specifically designed for long-range reconnaissance missions, and she had visited 37 human colonies scattered across 3 different spiral arms of the galaxy. What she found at each location was both reassuring and deeply troubling. The human colonies were not just surviving without the galactic community, they were thriving. Every world Nina visited showed signs of rapid expansion and technological advancement. New cities were being built, orbital stations were under construction, and terraforming projects were transforming marginal worlds into garden paradises. The humans had clearly been planning their independence for much longer than anyone realized. Nina's first stop had been New Montana, a farming colony that supplied agricultural products to 12 different star systems. She expected to find struggling settlers dealing with economic isolation and supply shortages. Instead, she discovered massive automated farms, producing more food than the colony had ever grown before. The humans had developed new farming techniques that tripled their crop yields while requiring half the labor. When Nina tried to establish contact, the response was polite but firm. "This is Captain Dan Hughes of the Colony Defense Force," came the transmission from a sleek ship that appeared beside the horizon within minutes. "You are in human territorial space. Please state your business or depart immediately." Nina explained that she was representing the Galactic Council and desperately needed to speak with human leadership about returning to Council space. Dan's response was courteous but absolute. "The Council's business is no longer our concern. You have 30 minutes to leave our system before we escort you out." The pattern was the same at every colony Nina visited. Humans were busy building something new and had no interest in discussing their old relationships with alien species. They were not hiding or struggling. They were simply ignoring the rest of the galaxy while focusing on their own civilization. At the mining colony on Kepler's Edge, Nina watched massive construction projects that dwarfed anything she had seen in Council space. Humans were building orbital elevators, asteroid processing stations, and spacecraft that used technologies she did not recognize. The mining operation was extracting rare metals at rates that should have been impossible with known techniques. Colony Administrator Beth Coleman agreed to a brief conversation, but only to make things clear. "We appreciate the Council's concern," Beth said over the communication link, "but humanity has chosen a different path. We are no longer interested in being junior partners in someone else's civilization." Nina tried to explain how much the galaxy needed human expertise to solve the growing crises. Beth listened patiently and then responded with words that would haunt Nina for months afterward. "The galaxy had hundreds of years to treat us as equals instead of useful servants. You chose to take our contributions for granted while dismissing our ideas and concerns. That choice has consequences." The most shocking discovery came at Earth itself. Nina had expected to find the human homeworld struggling with isolation and economic decline. Instead, she found a planet that was busier and more prosperous than she had ever seen it. Massive space elevators connected the surface to orbital construction yards where hundreds of new ships were being built. The moon had been converted into a mining and manufacturing complex that rivaled anything in Council space. Admiral Chris Thompson met Nina's ship at the edge of the solar system. His vessel was larger and more advanced than anything in the Council fleet, clearly built with technologies that humans had developed since leaving galactic civilization. "Captain Foster," he said in a voice that was both respectful and final, "you are welcome to observe our progress from a distance, but you will not be permitted to enter human space." Nina spent 3 days at the edge of the solar system, watching human activity through her ship's sensors. What she saw was a civilization that had been reborn with a purpose and energy that was both inspiring and terrifying. Humans were building not just for survival, but for expansion on a scale that suggested they were planning to spread across the galaxy on their own terms. The intelligence reports Nina gathered during her mission painted a picture that shattered every assumption the Council had made about humanity's departure. This was not an emotional reaction to being underappreciated. This was the execution of a long-term strategy that had been decades in the making. Every human who had served in Council space had been gathering information about alien technologies, mapping supply chains, and identifying critical dependencies. Dr. Richard Hayes, who had seemed like just another human researcher working on xenobiology, had actually been conducting a comprehensive analysis of galactic civilization's weaknesses and strengths. Engineer Lisa Adams had not just been helping with infrastructure projects. She had been documenting exactly how much the galaxy depended on human expertise for basic functions. Diplomat Robert Clark had not just been mediating disputes, he had been studying the underlying conflicts that human presence had been suppressing. The humans had spent 50 years quietly learning everything they needed to know about their alien neighbors, while those same neighbors had learned almost nothing about human capabilities, motivations, or long-term goals. It was the most successful intelligence operation in galactic history, conducted by people who appeared to be simple civil servants and technical specialists. Nina realized that humanity's withdrawal had not weakened them. It had freed them to become something more powerful than they had ever been as Council members. Without the constraints of galactic politics and the burden of constantly solving other species' problems, humans were advancing at a rate that would soon make them the dominant force in the galaxy. The search mission that was supposed to find desperate humans begging to return had instead discovered a civilization that was preparing to reshape the galaxy according to their own vision. Nina's final report to the Council contained a warning that few were prepared to hear. The humans were not planning to rejoin galactic civilization because they were building a better one to replace it. When Nina returned to Council space, she found a galaxy that was continuing to fall apart while the humans grew stronger with each passing day. The species that had taken human contributions for granted were about to learn what it meant to face humanity as competitors instead of helpers. Zethkar was desperate enough to authorize something he had never done before, sending spies into human space. The mission was dangerous and probably illegal, but the Galactic Council was dying and he needed to understand what humanity was really planning. Agent Veltar was the best infiltration specialist in the Vraxian intelligence service, capable of surviving in almost any environment and blending into most civilizations. Veltar spent 3 months moving carefully through human territory, using stolen identities and forged documents to gain access to facilities that should have been secure. What he discovered was so shocking that he requested emergency extraction after barely half of his planned mission time. His report would destroy every assumption the Council had ever made about their former human partners. The infiltration began at a human research facility on the planet New Geneva. Veltar posed as a maintenance worker for the automated systems, a job that gave him access to most areas of the complex while requiring minimal interaction with actual humans. What he found in the computer files made him question everything he thought he knew about human capabilities. The research facility was not working on the kind of basic science projects that humans had pursued while they were Council members. Instead, they were developing technologies that were decades ahead of anything in galactic civilization, faster than light engines that could cross the galaxy in days instead of months, weapons systems that could disable entire fleets without destroying them, terraforming techniques that could make any planet habitable in years instead of centuries. More disturbing was the discovery that these advanced technologies were based on research that humans had been conducting secretly for over 50 years. While they appeared to be cooperating with Council scientific projects, human researchers had been pursuing parallel investigations that built on alien knowledge while developing uniquely human innovations. Dr. Richard Hayes had been the key figure in this deception. As the lead xenobiology researcher for the Council, he had access to biological samples and research data from every member species. But instead of just contributing to joint projects, he had been using this information to develop human-specific enhancements that made their people smarter, stronger, and longer-lived than any other species in the galaxy. Veltar's investigation revealed that Richard had been working with a secret network of human scientists who were embedded throughout Council space. They appeared to be ordinary researchers, engineers, and medical specialists, but they were actually part of a coordinated intelligence operation that had been mapping every aspect of galactic civilization for decades. Engineer Beth Coleman had not just been helping with infrastructure projects. She had been documenting the critical failure points in every system that connected the various species. She knew exactly which space stations were essential for trade routes, which communication relays were needed for interspecies coordination, and which manufacturing facilities were required for maintaining galactic technology. Beth's real job had been creating a comprehensive map of how to shut down galactic civilization quickly and efficiently if that ever became necessary. Every project she worked on gave her access to more vital systems and deeper knowledge of how they could be disrupted. The humans had not just been contributing to galactic infrastructure. They had been studying how to destroy it. The most devastating discovery came when Veltar infiltrated a human military training facility on the planet New Sparta. He expected to find basic defense forces preparing to protect human colonies from potential alien aggression. Instead, he found an army that was being trained to conquer and occupy alien worlds using strategies specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses of each Council species. Human military planners had spent decades studying every alien civilization, learning their combat doctrines, identifying their technological vulnerabilities, and developing countermeasures for their defensive systems. They had created battle plans for defeating every major species in the galaxy, either individually or in various alliance combinations. The training scenarios Veltar observed were terrifyingly sophisticated. Human soldiers were practicing how to fight in the high-pressure environments that Thels required, how to disrupt the quantum communication systems that Zarathi relied on, and how to neutralize the collective consciousness that gave hive mind species their tactical advantages. What made this even more frightening was that the humans were not training to fight defensive wars to protect their own territories. They were preparing for aggressive campaigns designed to capture and hold alien worlds while minimizing casualties on both sides. The goal was not to destroy other species but to defeat them so completely that resistance would become impossible. Veltar realized that humanity's withdrawal from the Council had not been an emotional reaction to being underappreciated. It had been the first phase of a carefully planned strategy to become the dominant species in the galaxy. Every year that humans had spent as helpful Council members had actually been preparation for the day when they would replace the Council. With their own vision of galactic civilization, the evidence was overwhelming and terrifying. Humans had been conducting the most successful long-term intelligence operation in galactic history, while appearing to be the most cooperative and helpful species anyone had ever encountered. They had learned everything they needed to know about their alien neighbors while revealing almost nothing about their own true capabilities and intentions. When Veltar tried to investigate human population centers, he discovered that their colonies were not just thriving, they were expanding at an exponential rate. Human families were having more children than any other species in the galaxy, and those children were being educated in advanced sciences that other civilizations had never developed. The humans were not just building a better civilization for themselves. They were preparing to share it with other species, whether those species wanted it or not. Their long-term plan appeared to be creating a galactic empire where human values, human technology, and human leadership would guide all intelligent life toward what they considered a better future. Veltar's final report contained a conclusion that would haunt the Council for the rest of its brief remaining existence. The humans had never been junior partners learning from more advanced civilizations. They had been patient predators studying their prey while appearing harmless and helpful. Now they were ready to strike, and their former allies had given them every tool they needed to succeed. The species that had thought they were teaching primitive humans how to participate in galactic civilization had actually been providing their future conquerors with detailed intelligence about how to destroy everything they had built. The galaxy was about to learn that underestimating humanity had been the greatest mistake in the history of interstellar relations. 2 years after humanity's departure, the Galactic Council no longer existed as a functioning government. Zethkar sat alone in his former office, surrounded by empty corridors and darkened chambers that had once buzzed with diplomatic activity. The building itself was scheduled for demolition next week, one of the last symbolic acts of a civilization that was tearing itself apart. The collapse had happened faster than anyone thought possible. The economic systems that humans had maintained finally failed completely, leaving most species unable to trade with each other. The military conflicts that human peacekeepers had prevented escalated into full-scale wars that consumed entire sectors. The technological cooperation that human engineers had facilitated disintegrated into competing research programs that accomplished nothing. 47 species that had worked together for centuries were now scattered into dozens of smaller alliances based on old tribal connections and ancient prejudices. The Vraxian Empire was fighting a three-front war against the Kalari Republic, the Theron Federation, and a coalition of smaller species. The aquatic Thels had retreated to their underwater cities and refused all contact with surface dwellers. The crystalline Zarathi had declared that organic life was too chaotic to cooperate with, and sealed themselves off from the rest of the galaxy. The wars were particularly brutal because nobody understood how to fight them properly. For generations, conflicts had been resolved through human mediation before they reached the shooting stage. Now that shooting had started, species were discovering that they had forgotten how to conduct military operations, negotiate surrenders, or establish peace treaties. Battles raged on long after any strategic purpose had been achieved, simply because nobody knew how to stop them. Zethkar had tried everything to hold the council together. He had offered economic incentives, military assistance, and territorial concessions to keep species from withdrawing. He had personally traveled to dozens of worlds trying to rebuild the alliances that were falling apart. He had even sent desperate messages to human colonies begging for any kind of help or guidance. The humans had ignored every attempt at communication. Their response to council envoys was always the same polite but absolute refusal to discuss rejoining galactic civilization. They were too busy building something new to waste time trying to repair something old that they considered fundamentally broken. The final delegation to human space had been Zethkar's last hope. He had assembled representatives from every remaining council species and personally led them to the edge of human territory. Surely the sight of a galaxy in chaos would convince humanity to return and help restore order. Surely they would not allow billions of beings to suffer for the sake of proving a political point. Admiral Chris Thompson met them at the border in a ship that was larger and more advanced than anything in the former council fleet. His vessel represented technology that was at least 50 years ahead of what the rest of the galaxy could produce. When Zethkar saw it, he realized that the humans had not just been planning their departure. They had been preparing to replace everyone else as the dominant force in space. The conversation that followed was brief and final. Zethkar pleaded with Admiral Thompson to consider the suffering that was spreading across the galaxy. Millions of beings were dying in wars that human peacekeepers could have prevented. Entire civilizations were collapsing without the economic and technical support that humans had provided. The knowledge and culture of dozens of species would be lost forever if something was not done quickly. Admiral Thompson listened to every word with the patient attention that humans had always shown. During diplomatic meetings, when Zethkar finished his plea, the Admiral's response was measured and absolute. "Speaker Zethkar, you had 1,000 years to treat us as partners instead of convenient tools. You chose to see us as useful servants rather than equals." The Admiral's words cut through every excuse and rationalization that the Council had used to justify their treatment of humanity. For centuries, humans had been the people who solved problems that nobody else wanted to deal with. They had been the mediators who prevented conflicts, the engineers who made impossible projects work, and the economists who kept trade flowing smoothly between incompatible civilizations. But they had never been considered true partners in galactic civilization. Their ideas were useful when they solved immediate problems, but they were ignored when it came to long-term planning. Their contributions were valuable when they made life easier for other species, but they were taken for granted when they prevented disasters. Their diplomatic skills were essential for maintaining peace, but they were excluded from the real decisions about how the galaxy should be governed. "The galaxy taught us that respect must be earned through absence, not presence," Admiral Thompson continued. "Perhaps in a few centuries, when you have learned to value cooperation over exploitation, we might consider rejoining galactic civilization. Until then, humanity will forge its own path among the stars." The delegation returned to a crumbling council with news that shattered the last hopes for salvation. The humans were not coming back. The species that had held galactic civilization together through sheer competence and goodwill had moved beyond the need for alien cooperation. They were building something better on their own terms. Zethkar spent his final days in office reading reports about human expansion across the galaxy. Their colonies were spreading faster than any species had ever managed, using terraforming technologies that could transform dead worlds into garden paradises in a matter of years. Their ships were appearing in systems that had been considered too dangerous or too remote for colonization. The humans were not just surviving without the galactic community. They were thriving beyond anything they had achieved as council members. Free from the burden of constantly solving other species' problems, they were advancing at a rate that would soon make them the dominant civilization in known space. The bitter irony was that humanity's success was built on everything they had learned during their time as underappreciated council members. Every crisis they had solved had taught them more about managing complex civilizations. Every technology they had integrated had given them insights into advanced engineering. Every conflict they had mediated had shown them how to prevent the mistakes that were now destroying their former allies. The galaxy had trained its own replacement without realizing what it was doing. In trying to use human capabilities for their own benefit, the other species had created a civilization that no longer needed them for anything. The Council's final lesson was that some opportunities for cooperation, once lost through arrogance and neglect, could never be recovered.